Hey guys, tonight, we're dimming the candles, fluffing the pillows, and floating back to a time when history felt less like a textbook and more like a weird fever dream with crowns and swords. Yeah, we re-wandering into the medieval world where reality often looks suspiciously like someone's poorly thought out miracle story. So, let's relax, breathe, and step into a strange little pocket of history where people thought comets caused plagues, monks kept miracle logs, and coincidences were pretty much official evidence of divine interference. Let's begin. You know that thing when two completely random events line up so perfectly that your brain just pauses for a second? Like a glitch in the medieval matrix. The Middle Ages were basically full of that. Except, instead of calling it coincidence, they usually just said, "Ah, yes, God did that." And everyone nodded. But some of these cases were just too neat. Too oddly symmetrical. Tonight, we'll stroll through a few of them, very quietly, like respectful guests wandering through a haunted royal archive. You'll see what I mean. Let's drift first to King Henry II of England, a man famous for being clever, ruthless, and aggressively stressed about everything. His life already reads like the script of a cosmic prank. Henry had 4 sons, each of whom decided, at various times, to rebel against him. Perfectly reasonable family cohesion. Obviously. Now, the weird part isn't that they rebelled that every single major betrayal in his life happened at the exact same intervals after a significant church scandal. For example, right after he argued explosively with Thomas Becket, and Becket ended up murdered in Canterbury Cathedral. About 5 years later, his first son started an uprising, then another church scandal, then another rebellion, timed almost eerily. Chroniclers noticed the pattern. They didn't call it coincidence. They called it the divine symmetry. And when Henry died in 1189, disheveled, sick, and bitter, the messenger who brought him the news that his son had finally turned on him was, named, no exaggeration, William the Betrayer. You can't script that irony. Medieval chroniclers didn't even try to hide their bafflement. They wrote things like, "And lo, God, who loves patterns, thus closed the circle." Let's float onward. Far away in Bohemia, around the same century, we meet good King Wences. Despite the Christmas Carol branding, was murdered by his charmingly awful younger brother, Boleslas the Cruel. Now here's where things get twinge-level eerie. Both Wenceslas and his killer brother were born on the same day exactly 7 years apart. Both were also named after saints connected to wait for it brotherly love. Wenceslas was named after Saint Wenceslas, obviously, and Boleslas was christened under the patronage of Saint Michael, the protector of siblings. You can't help but feel like Phaetor, a medieval scribe with too much imagination, was trying to prove a point. When Wenceslas was stabbed to death by Boleslas at the door of a church, the chroniclers say a strange light hovered above his body for 3 nights. Probably marsh gas. Yes, but naturally everyone took it as divine verification that the family drama had been pre-approved by heaven itself. Even later, when Boleslas died peacefully, somehow he was buried beside his brother. Their tomb inscriptions were reportedly identical, down to the punctuation. Just a blank mirror. Coincidence? Maybe. Or maybe, some medieval mason thought, this'll mess with the monks in 100 years. Let's travel a little west, softly, to France. Because the French court, bless it, was basically a walking supernatural sitcom. In the 14th century, King John II of France, nicknamed John the Good, for reasons no one quite remembers, was captured by the English during the 100 Years' War. He was treated well in London, given privileges, even allowed servants, and hunting trips. But when one of his sons, a hostage substitute, escaped back to France, John voluntarily returned to captivity to maintain his honor. That, in itself, is weirdly noble. But here's the eerie twist. Exactly 100 years earlier, another French king held captive by the English had done the exact opposite. Broken Perot refused to return, and was cursed in chronicles for shameful behavior. And here's the neat little kicker. Both treaties sealing those imprisonments were signed on April 6th. Chroniclers loved that kind of palindromic irony. To them, dates weren't coincidences. They were divine fingerprints, and in the strangest possible sequel effect, John the Good's grandson, Charles VI, later went insane, believing at one point that he was made of glass. His delusion began on, you guessed it, April 6 Ace. That date became sort of cursed in the royal calendar, though no one dared to officially erase it, because in medieval logic, tampering with a cursed date was basically begging the universe to do it again. Let's glide forward, because these patterns just keep looping. Across the channel again, the English seemed determined to outdo everyone in weird coincidences. Enter Edward II, the king who lost his crown, his friends, and possibly his life in one of the murkiest chapters of royal history. Edward was deposed by his wife Isabella, known poetically, and with some understatement, as the Cheval for France. Historians can confirm the rebellion. What they can't confirm is why 3 different witnesses reported lightning striking the exact same tower of Berkeley Castle on the day Edward supposedly died. It rained in Gloucestershire a lot, sure, but not usually with precision lightning. And then came the stunt of cosmic irony. A few years later, Isabella's own favorite castle burned down entirely, according to monastic records, by the same quick thunder from heaven. Maybe medieval weather just liked drama. Even better, one of Edward's jailers later married Isabella's chambermaid, and their child grew up to serve under Edward III, the son of the man allegedly killed by his mother. That child's birthday, June 21st, the exact day Edward II had been born. Coincidence? Again. Or the universe just quietly trolling the planet? We could gently sip our tea and stop here. But no. The Middle Ages had endless appetite for coincidences, especially those that felt too symmetrical to ignore. Let's slide, almost dreamily, into one of my favorites, the tale of the twin solar eclipses. In 1133, a rare total eclipse darkened England for several minutes, right after King Henry I left the kingdom to wage war in Normandy. Chroniclers wrote that the sun mourned as the king departed. People genuinely panicked. Birds went silent. Priests publicly repented of vague sins, and then years later, in 1150, another eclipse hit. Almost the same path, almost the same length, the same month. This time marking the death of Henry I's dynasty when his only legitimate grandson drowned at sea, to perfectly mirrored celestial events. 2 dynastic downfalls, and 2 English chroniclers writing decades apart, both used the same phrase. The sun departed with the king. Coincidence stacked on coincidence. But to medieval people, that wasn't eerie, it was comforting. It meant the cosmos was paying attention. Slowly now, we drift toward Italy, because Italy, in medieval storytelling, is where coincidences went for a dramatic makeover. In the city of Florence, in 1321, a man named Dante Alighieri died of fever. You may remember him for a little poem about hell and suffering it caught on later. But here is the chillingly poetic twist. He died on the exact date, September 13th, that he himself had predicted as a turning point in his poem Purgatorio decades earlier. He literally wrote that the great heavenly bodies would align on that day to mark a mortal passage to divine realms. Of course, scholars shrugged it off, now as symbolic fiction. But still dying on the fictional date you invented for crossing into paradise is neat. Perhaps too neat. Even weirder. His bones were stolen by monks in Ravenna, who claimed an angel told them the poet wanted quiet. They hid the remains, and nobody found them again until 1865, coincidentally, the 600th anniversary of his birth year. Medieval coincidence, it seems, sometimes waited centuries just to complete its symmetry. Let's pause for a breath, maybe take a sip of water, because the next one, while soft and understated, sounds like something pulled from a medieval screenplay that no one would believe. In 1429, a French soldier named Jean de Metz was recorded as meeting a 17-year-old girl named Jeanne d'Arc, who claimed angels spoke to her. He was skeptical until she told him that his last prayer, muttered privately that morning, had been answered. Later in life, Jeanne de Metz claimed that exact scene happened again years later. At her execution, when she supposedly smiled through the flames, just as in his old dream. The thing is, his military companions swore he'd described that very dream months before he even met her. Let's be honest, that could be memory, inflation, or grief narrative. But still, the circular poetry of it stuck. Even the scribes who doubted her sanctity quietly wrote, "The Lord often reuses his miracles." Medieval understatement at its finest. By now, if your eyelids are feeling heavy, good. That's sort of how the Middle Ages wanted you. Lulled, a little confused, halfway between faith and fact. But before we drift off, one final tale for tonight's first part of coincidence, so human, so small. It almost feels scripted. In 1297, in the town of Ghent, 2 infants were christened on the same morning, one named Philip, one Margaret. They were from separate families, and neither of noble blood. Decades later, both became servants at the Burgundian court. They married different people. Their children, completely by accident, ended up marrying each other. Philip's granddaughter to Margaret's grandson without anyone realizing until the genealogies were checked. Their wedding day, the same date as their great-grandparents' christening. When the chronicler who recorded this was asked if he believed it, he said, "Of course, the Lord loves tidy tables," which, in medieval translation, meant, yeah, coincidence, but divine-grade coincidence. And that's where we'll rest tonight, halfway between order and chaos, in the gentle hum of a world that saw meaning everywhere it looked. Next time, we'll wander deeper into saints whose relics multiplied suspiciously, kings who dreamed of their own deaths to the minute, and prophecies that accidentally came true centuries later. But for now, just let your mind drift. Because, as medieval people would say, everything connects. Eventually, hey again! Welcome back. The candlelight's dim. The air smells faintly of old parchment, and maybe a hint of hypocrisy. And we're gliding now through the kind of stories where faith and pattern recognition politely held hands. If you've ever had the feeling that history occasionally winks at itself, the saints and monks of the Middle Ages practically built entire careers out of that idea. Let's start with one of the more famous examples, Saint Bernard of Clairvaux, the man who could have won a gold medal in unintentional irony. Bernard spent decades preaching that humility was the crown of all Christian virtues. He publicly scolded monks who sought visions or miracles. And then, on the night of his own death, 3 separate monks saw a glowing crown appear above his bed. Humility crowned by a literal crown of light. Eben and Ding, he got publicly contradicted by divine symbolism. And it gets even stranger. Every year, on the anniversary of his death, his abbey's bells would ring spontaneously, right before midnight. Records of that continue for nearly 2 centuries. When the Archbishop of Lyon finally investigated, he found no explanation. So they just shrugged and called it the Lord keeping time. The medieval mind didn't doubt coincidences much. They organized them. Now, gliding east to war, Bohemia again. Let's visit the case of St. John of Nepomuc, a man who drowned, a mouth that refused to stay silent even underwater. He was a confessor to the Queen of Bohemia and apparently refused to reveal her secret sins to King Wenceslas IV. The furious king tossed him into the Vutava River, and that should have been that. But then, as the story goes, 5 lights appeared over the water that night, glowing like candles, marking exactly where his body was found the next morning. Hence why his statues along Prague's Charles Bridge always feature 5 stars circling his head. Centuries later, when his tomb was opened for verification, Catholic officials claimed his tongue was mysteriously preserved. Scientists today propose it wasn't the tongue, but connective tissue hardened by mineral dust. But Eventend, the discovery date fell on May 16th. His recorded day of death, coincidence, revision, or just medieval flair for perfect narrative symmetry? Take your pick. Speaking of symmetry, few saints achieved it quite like St. Catherine of Siena, who seemed born to demonstrate cosmic patterning. She was one of 25 children. That's already statistically exceptional. But 12 of them died at infancy, and exactly 13 reached adulthood. Catherine, child number 24, often said she was between 2 worlds. When she died in 1380, she was exactly 33, the age of Christ, and by medieval arithmetic that clinched her divine legitimacy. But what really tugged at chroniclers' curiosity wasn't her age. At death, it was how her body refused to decay. The process of canonization found that her hands and feet remained flexible for weeks, and the date her remains were officially reburied in Rome, April 29th. Her feast day, though the order hadn't requested that date, the papal office picked it by calendar chants. Medieval chants apparently loved rhymes. Let's float gently now toward England. The monks here loved keeping track of strange patterns, sometimes more diligently than their own income records. The monks of St. Edmundsbury, for instance, ran a detailed miracle ledger. One of their oddest coincidences occurred in 1218. A group of pilgrims from Kent had reported that the exact same relic, a fragment of St. Edmund's robe, was performing identical miracles on two sides of the country at the same time. That's right. Two priests claimed to have the same piece of robe, and both watched it cure two separate cases of blindness on the same night. Rather than call someone a liar, the abbé rolled with it. Their conclusion was that the spirit of the relic walks faster than its cloth. Essentially, yes, relic duplication was real. Version control, medieval style. This idea spread fast. Multiplying relics became common theological loopholes. The body of a saint could be in 5 cities, the bones divided infinitely, because miracles respected no geography. By the 1400s, they treated coincidence as a divine administrative tool. Multiple heads of John the Baptist, sure, because holiness echoed. And speaking of echoes, let's drift into one of the more poetic coincidences tucked in the margins of history, the tale of the Twin Kings' dreams. Around 1200, Philip II of France and John of England were constantly at war over who had the right to certain French territories. Perfectly normal royal behavior, but the coincidences in their dreams made even their scribes uncomfortable. The royal recorders noted that both men claimed to have the same nightmare on the same night of a dragon devouring Europe, with each man standing helplessly at opposite ends of the beast. Philip dreamed this on Holy Saturday. John, in England, on Easter morning, accounting for time difference. Those nights overlapped. The chroniclers preserved both dreams without alteration, noting the eerie overlap. And yes, within the same lunar cycle, Philip invaded John's territory and permanently stripped England of most of its land in France. The scribes wrote, "Thus the dragon woke." No one called it coincidence. It was prophecy after the fact, but you could sense, behind the ink, a sophoniase, as if even they doubted the neatness of it all. Drifting south once more, the story of the two Giovannis deserves a thought. In the small Tuscan town of Pistoia, in 1348, the middle of the Black Death, two local priests, named Giovanni, died within a day of each other. Both were buried hastily in separate graves. A century later, when the town was renovating its cathedral, their coffins were uncovered directly opposite each other, under the nave. Each had the same inscription on the lid: Sacerdos Fideles et Servis, day written in the same hand. Nobody knew who wrote it. Both coffins had identical wood. The scribes checked for a duplication error, but found the registry recorded them correctly, two different People started calling them the mirrored priests. By the 16th century, pilgrims visited that nave to pray for reconciliation between enemies. The logic wasn't theological, just aesthetic. Even holy men, apparently, came in matching pairs. If the medieval mind had a weakness, it was delight in these patterns, a kind of sleepy wonder at the idea that destiny had a sense of rhythm, and nothing expressed that better than the case of Saint Alban, Britain's first martyr. He was beheaded by a Roman soldier on a hill outside Verulamium, sometime around 258. According to legend, his head rolled down the slope, and where it fell, a spring of pure water burst out of the ground. Fast forward nearly 1,000 years to 1170. That same hill collapsed during a strange storm that exposed Wait for Ita, buried ossuary with the exact same dimensions described in S. Earlius Hagiography. It's probably pure topographic coincidence, the kind archaeologists can explain with all the enthusiasm of a deflated balloon. But in 1170, it was headline news, especially since, on that same year, another English martyr's blood spilled. Thomas Becket, also in December. Chroniclers loved symmetry, so they made sure both martyrs in their books had matching miracles by Christmas. Divine Bookkeeping. Medieval edition. We could end there, but one more quiet pattern glides by, too subtle to ignore. In 1349, amid the plague's worst wave, towns across Europe rang church bells to ward off evil air. In at least 13 different cities, the bell towers crashed down all within 3 days of each other, starting on a new moon. Medieval people had a saying: when bells fall, sins weigh more. Modern historians reasonably note that most of those bells were made from the same flawed batch of bronze or traded along the Rhine. But that explanation didn't stick for the 14th century. For them, the bells weren't breaking, they were answering. And unfortunately, the answer was no. So there we have it. From mirrored priests to prophetic kings, glowing crowns to self-replicating relics, medieval coincidence didn't just inspire curiosity, it created comfort. Every repeated pattern, every matching date, every twin event whispered that life wasn't random, even when it looked absurd. And maybe that's the sleepiest lesson of medieval history, that sometimes, to a world half-lit by candlelight, coincidence was just a god, is a handwriting only slower and fancier. Hey again! Still awake? Don't worry. This isn't a test. Tonight's part is less about saints glowing in the dark and more about royals quietly repeating each other as tragedies like bad reruns, because, as it turns out, the Middle Ages adored repetition. Kings died the same way their grandfathers did. Queens gave birth on the same feast days. Heirs were born under the same eclipses that had haunted their ancestors. The royal record books read like identical copies with new ink. Let us ease in with a soft favorite among historians of irony: the repeating reigns of the Henrys of England. Henry I gained power after his older brother died in a suspicious shipwreck, the famous White Ship disaster in 1120. The only legitimate male heir drowned that night, leaving a succession crisis so messy it might as well have been written by fate in tablet form. Now jump ahead 2 centuries. Henry III is a grandson. Henry Finck also rose to power after his father struggled with what we might politely call violent, inconvenient madness. And then, another 2 centuries after that, Henry VI lost his throne in a civil war caused by his own mental breakdown. 3 Henrys spaced almost equidistantly through English history, each defined by accidents of inheritance and mental decline in the generation before them. Every 200 years or so, English chroniclers scribbled the same line: thus God visited England again. No one in the 15th century noticed the pattern consciously, but modern historians have. The symmetries. Uncanny, Henry I to Henry V. 2 centuries. Henry V to Henry VI, 25 years. Both reigns ending with lost heirs and civil rebellion. Coincidence stacked like weary dominoes. Now let's drift south to Castile, where the Isabellas, bless them, set new records for historical disease. Isabella of Castile, famous for uniting Spain with Ferdinand, was born in 1451, a turbulent year marked by the death of another queen, also named Isabella, also childless, also in Castile. The chroniclers claimed royal astrologers had confused the day. They predicted a queen's reign beginning, though one ended instead. Even stranger, Queen Isabella's daughter, also Isabella, because originality wasn't a strong royal trait, later married the Portuguese king and died in childbirth. At the same age her mother had been when she demarried Ferdinand. Both events took place in the same castle, under the same tapestry canopy, in August, recorded by the same family chronicler. The Manus diary notes the moment with exhausted disbelief. God writes his plays with poor editors. It is the kind of detail the Middle Ages thrived on. A universe that seemed to copy-paste destinies with lazy precision. But in France, things got no less symmetrical. The Louis dynasty practically ran on mirrored lives. Louis VIII reigned for exactly 3 years. His grandson, Louis X, died exactly 3 years after his coronation. Both had one legitimate son who died in infancy. Both buried on the same date in June, nearly a century apart. Even their causes of death, echoed strangely. Louis VIII supposedly died of dysentery during a campaign. Louis VI, conveniently, also died after bad wine on a hot June march. Chroniclers couldn't tell whether it was heatstroke or divine satire. Later, when Louis XIV, yes, the Sun King, was born, the astrologers made note that his birth chart shared striking similarities with those earlier Louis, the same planetary alignment, the same solar conjunction. For that reason, his tutors often called him the repairer of the pattern. A little cosmic humor, courtesy of 17th century optimism. It's almost sweet, in a bleak celestial way. Meanwhile, in Central Europe, the Habsburgs were, as always, the main characters in history's genetic subplot. By the late Middle Ages, their family tree looked more like a family wreath, and even coincidences in this dynasty became hereditary. Archduke Philip the Fair, not to be confused with Philip the Handsome, who was technically the same person by another nickname, because medieval branding, died unexpectedly at 28. His son Charles, who would later be Emperor Charles V, suffered his first nervous breakdown at 28. His great-grandson, Charles II of Spain, famously died on his 28th year of reign, which conveniently fell at the same age his ancestor Philip had died. Now, that could be math coincidence. But the same chronicles that recorded those deaths also noted their uncanny parallels in appearance. Each had the same distinctive Habsburg jaw, described somewhat rudely by one ambassador as chin-seeking earth. People whispered that it was in the genetics, but the weight of family sorrow pressing each face downward, which is possibly the most poetic justification for inbreeding anyone's ever written, floated eastward again to Poland, the Jagiellonian dynasty, where fate apparently liked geometry. 4 successive kings, W, Edis, Aurelius Casimir IV, John, E, and Sigismund I, were all born on a Monday, all crowned on a Sunday, and all died within the same week number of the calendar year. It's the sort of trivia that modern statisticians wave away, but medieval courtiers practically wrote astrology manuals about it. There est even an account of Sigismund I refusing to plan major decrees on Thursdays because it had stolen too many crowned heads. And here's the gently absurd detail. When his son, Sigismund II Augustus, was born on a Thursday, the royal nurse fainted. Church bells reportedly rang themselves in silent confusion, though that was probably enthusiastic bell rope handling. Thursdays never recovered their reputation in Poland after that. Now let's gently wander northward to Scandinavia, where rulers tended to have names like Magnus, Olaf, and someone the Grey. The Viking inheritance of naming conventions made coincidences basically inevitable. But even by those low standards, the Magnus loop is uncanny. 3 kings named Magnus ruled Norway across 200 years. Magnus the Good, Magnus Barefoot, and Magnus the Blind. Their reigns lined up like accidental trilogies. Each ascended during a civil war. Each died violently in his early 30s, and each had a last recorded quote that referred to light. Magnus the Good cried, "The sun." While dying from wounds, Magnus Barefoot allegedly died, turning toward the dawn. Magnus the Blind's final line, according to the saga, was "I see more clearly." Coincidence, or literary embellishment, doesn't matter. The sagas lean fully into the poetic parallel, as though fate itself was binge-writing Magnus-y sequels with strong symbolic focus, slipping softly now toward the Mediterranean. Sicily, the crossroads of medieval empires, holds one of my favorite cases of historical déjà vu. In 1282, the infamous Sicilian Vespers uprising erupted at evening prayers, when a French soldier insulted a local woman outside a church. The offended crowd rioted, the French occupation collapsed, and Sicily regained its independence. Flash forward exactly 300 years. In 1582, also at evening prayers, in the same city of Palermo, local barons conspired to expel a Spanish governor. Again beginning during the Vespers bell. Different century, same hour, same setting, same country, briefly overthrowing foreign rule. The locals, understandably suspicious of patterns, refused to hold evening services on that date for decades afterward. Monks noted in the church minutes, once, maybe righteous fury. Twice, may be God's reminder. Thrice, if it comes, we shall move to morning masses only. As far as historical notes go, that's accidental comedy disguised as piety. And then there's Richard II of England, who somehow managed to turn cosmic timing into a full-blown lifestyle. He was crowned on the same day of the year his grandfather Edward III had been crowned by the same archbishop using the same ancient oil. He was deposed 22 years later, the exact same length of time between Edward II's deposition and his death. His body was buried at Church Langley, right beside the tomb where Edward II's heart had been kept in a relic, because, of course, it was. Two medieval record keepers. These weren't accidents. They were affirmations. God, they believed, recycled symbols like he reused good prophecy material. Now, not all medieval coincidences were solemn. Some were just oddly cute. In 1461, during England's Wars of the Roses, a battle near Towton, the largest and bloodiest of the conflict, was fought under falling snow. Chroniclers noted it as a pale storm like heaven's morning. The next time it snowed during battle between York and Lancaster, exactly 50 years later. To the day, during the final skirmish that ended the Tudor accession, 2 snowstorms, same date, same warring colors. Coincidence? Sure. But the symbol-hungry Tudor poets afterward declared it destiny completing heaven's snowfall bookends. Even meteorology wasn't safe from historical pattern matching. By the late medieval period, Europe had developed this almost soothing relationship with recurrence. When tragedy repeated, they didn't resist it. They filed it neatly into divine order. So when the Black Death returned in rhythmic waves every few decades, people genuinely believed each recurrence was a cosmic metronome correcting human arrogance. Chroniclers began noting with mild awe that the plague peaks roughly aligned with major celestial events, conjunctions of Mars and Saturn, eclipses, or even, yes, unlucky Thursdays again. Somewhere, I'm sure, a monk was quietly charting it all on a parchment spreadsheet, eyes half closed, murmuring, "It fits. Everything fits." And honestly, who can blame him? Predictable catastrophe is at least polite. Before we rest tonight, one last glimpse of pattern, one that threads across all the royal houses. Like a lullaby hum under the noise of centuries, every major medieval dynasty has an oddly consistent motif. The Restoration Child. The baby born exactly 9 months after a battle lost, a famine ended, or a ruler died. The cycle restarter. You can trace them from Scotland to Simalcolm, the Sedo born after his father was slain, to France's future, Charles VII, first conceived immediately after one of his father's humiliating defeats. Even the Byzantine emperors noted it. The womb repairs the crown. Fate, it seems, had the rhythm of a monk's chant and the sense of humor of a weary scribe. And that's where we'll pause, eyes heavy, minds wandering among royal ghosts and their endless mirrored stories, because maybe that is the gentle secret of medieval coincidence. Not that it is mystic or magical, but that humans, especially tired ones in candlelit halls, found it comforting to think the universe rhymed, and perhaps in its slow way. It really did. Hey there. Still drifting with me? Good. Tonight, we're leaving behind the English drizzle and French bishops to wander across the broader medieval world, where the same patterns seem to echo under desert skies, across steppe plains, and inside palaces wrapped in incense. Because even outside Europe's candlelight, fate clearly had a thing for symmetry. Let's start in the grand, gold-walled heart of the Abbasid Caliphate, where the idea of divine geometry ruled everything from architecture to astrology. In the 9th century, Caliph al-Mamun was obsessed with aligning Baghdad to the heavens. He believed the city's prosperity rose and fell in tandem with the visibility of a single star, the fiery eye of the bull in Taurus. He died in 833, at the moment that star dipped below the horizon during an eclipse. Coincidentally, 200 years later, another caliph, Al-Qadir, died during the exact same celestial event, same star, same eclipse cycle, same lunar node. Even the court astronomers, not known for emotional writing, admitted this was a rhythm known only to God. And then, as if keeping time with them, a similar eclipse darkened Constantinople the same night as Al-Qadir's death, which Byzantine monks promptly recorded as the dimming of the East and the West together. Medieval people didn't just connect dots, they embroidered them. Drifting eastward, the Byzantine Empire seemed haunted by its own coincidences. Emperors named Constantine seemed to punctuate history's turning points with uncanny precision. Constantine the Great forged the Christian Roman Empire in the 4th century, precisely 11 successors later. Constantine the 11th fell defending Constantinople in 1453. The prophecy was inevitable. The realm that rose with Constantine shall close with Constantine. Ottoman chroniclers, recording the city's fall, highlighted the ominous celestial choreography, a lunar eclipse that heralded the siege, followed by a blood-red moon over the Bosphorus on the eve of surrender. One observer noted the eclipse lasted exactly 3 hours and 30 minutes, mirroring the duration of an earlier siege under a prior Constantine. Theologians debated divine intent. Others shrugged and quipped, God scripts history, like a poet, not a bookkeeper. That may be the gentlest epitaph for medieval cosmology. Farther east, the Mongol Empire amplified the theme of cosmic symmetry. Temujin, later Genghis Khan, entered the world amid a thunderstorm, thunder rumbling across the steppe as a mark of Tengri's favor. 68 years on, when his grandson Kublai Khan proclaimed himself Emperor of China, another storm broke over Kambalik, Beijing. Chronicles describe identical lightning bolts striking the palace gate and a nearby tree echoing the night of Temujin's birth. The Mongols, ever pragmatic, dubbed both events the voice of Tengri. Stranger still, Genghis reportedly died on the same lunar day as his birth, though steppe calendars obscure verification. His scattered sons claim to dream of him as a white falcon at the exact moment of his passing, despite vast distances. To the Mongols, this was no mystery. It was divine efficiency. In China's Song dynasty, coincidences took on a near-mathematical rigor. Archivists observed that dynastic shifts often coincided with cataclysms. Emperor Tizu founded the Song in 960, just after a crippling drought. 2 centuries later, as Mongol invasions eroded the dynasty, another drought began on the identical lunar date, the 4th day of the 8th month. Song scholars enamored of patterns calculated intervals between emperors' accessions and prior solar eclipses, half aligned within days. They concluded heaven used the stars as its courier service. One astrologer remarked, "When heaven repeats, it offers a courteous nudge, not monotony." Arguably the most serene philosophy of fate ever penned. Southward in the Delhi Sultanate of the 13th and 14th centuries, the rhythm persisted. In 1290, Jalaluddin Khalji seized power from the Mamluks on the night of Mira, commemorating the prophet's heavenly ascent. 70 years later, the Tughlaqs toppled the Khalkhisagan on the night of Mirage, same lunar phase. Chroniclers noted laconically, "As above, so below." Even the built environment joined the chorus. Firoz sa te u ha el la ka. Ka's unfinished minaret cast a shadow that aligned almost perfectly with the Qutb minor erected a century earlier on the equinox. Medieval builders noticed, but said nothing. In India, geometry already served a higher purpose. In Japan, the cadence of coincidence was softer, like silk rippling over lacquered wood. Heian courtiers cherished the notion of twin fates, souls born at the same instant in distant provinces, their lives destined to braid together. Court diaries preserve one such pair, 2 boys named Yoshi, one cradled in a noble mansion, the other in a farmer's hut, both entering the world on the same moonlit night. Both grew to wield the brush with eerily identical strokes, a mark of spiritual kinship in a culture that read character in calligraphy. Both died at 25 on the same day. Diviners offered a verdict as elegant as a haiku. 1 brush, 2 hands. Fate-transcending station. Westward again, the Mamluk sultans of Egypt staged coincidence with theatrical grandeur. In 1250, Queen Shajar-ul-Durtha dynasty's sole female sovereign ascended after her husband perished in captivity. A century later, in 1350, Sultan al-Saleh Haji was ousted and reinstated following his father's death, in chains. Both claimed titles during Ramadan, both ruled less than 3 years, and both met their ends in palace betrayals by their own guards. Arabic chroniclers, sparing with awe, still caption the parallel reigns with the same line. History repeats its rhyme. They were not mistaken. By now, the medieval globe thrummed with patterns. Africa supplied its own harmonies. In the Mali Empire, Sundiata Keita's founding pilgrimage in 1235 aligned with the Heliacal rising of Sirius. 95 years later, Mansa Musa's famed Hajj to Mecca began on the identical celestial dawn. As if scripted, the Nile surged to record heights, both Tim's Egyptian almanacs and Malian griots noting the same prodigy. Arab geographers murmured of the whisper of alignment. Ancient hydrology, perhaps, but medieval scribes were drunk on symmetry. Then came the late 14th century crescendo, the synchronized collapse. Between 1350 and 1420, cataclysms overlapped across continents. The Great Schism in Europe, Mongol fragmentation in Asia, the Khmer Empire's fade, Mali's eclipse, famines from China to Ireland. Isolated chroniclers, unaware of one another, framed the era in the same metaphor. The world had grown old. Chinese astrologers spoke of a tilting sky, European friars of a shadow age, Cairo scholars of earthly independent civilizations, sharing no script, described a global twilight in identical tones. Coincidence or collective pulse? The 14th century owned a single cosmic mood, for a final, hushed echo. When Constantinople fell in 1453, Constantine XI vanished amid the melee. His body never recovered. Prophecy promised he slumbered beneath the Golden Gate, awaiting Christendom's revival. Almost simultaneously, in distant China, the Ming Emperor ordered the Forbidden City's completion, its own Golden Gate facing east, toward the imperial two edges of Eurasia. Twin myths of sleeping sovereigns behind golden thresholds. Mere chance. Or, as medieval minds preferred, stories orbiting like planets. So we leave the patter hunters adrift on their quiet revelation. Empires pulsed to a hidden drum. Stars winked in time with thrones, and across oceans and centuries, humanity whispered the same lullaby that history, perhaps, dreams in rhyme. Hey, again! You made it. 5 parts deep into a world that swore patterns were proof that God had a favorite kind of repetition. Let's take one more slow walk through the past, not toward the next coincidence, but into why they cared so much about finding it. Because medieval people didn't just live through history, they watched for history repeating. Like nervous astronomers scanning for another eclipse. For them, every echo was meaning, and their comfort in that rhythm might just be the most human thing they left behind. Imagine a monk alone in his scriptorium. It's night, his candles guttering low. Outside, maybe there's frost on the windowsill or just the soft weight of fog across the cloister garden. He's bent over a chronicle, a list of kings, deaths, eclipses, plagues, and he starts noticing, almost idly, that the gaps between disasters feel regular, familiar. It isn't fear, it's recognition. He starts adding notes in the margins. 7 years since the last famine, 20 between kings. Tiny, harmless math, but soon it becomes theology. He builds a rhythm from calamity. Somewhere behind him, someone rings the midnight bell, and he feels, for the first time, that maybe heaven keeps time too. That idea, that history was cyclical, maybe musical, stayed with Europe and beyond for centuries. It colored everything. When kings fell on anniversaries or babies were born under repeating stars, people didn't panic. They nodded, maybe said a prayer, and wrote it down as confirmation that creation still followed its sheet music. The deeper you look, the more it feels like the entire medieval world had one quiet obsession, the desire for symmetry. Medieval art was symmetrical. Their cathedrals, their gardens, their chronicles, all balanced like mirrors. If chaos existed, they wanted it framed neatly. The notion of coincidence being divine was really just an act of hope. In every mirrored birth, every repeated date, they weren't reading randomness, They were reading reassurance that something, somewhere, was watching. Which makes sense. Imagine living through an era with war, plague, and famine as recurring background music. Predictable design was survival comfort. If bad things repeated on schedule, at least reality had a calendar. There are chroniclers who voice this almost wistfully. A Benedictine monk, writing in 12th century Normandy, put it like this: each generation repeats its sadness, but differently tuned. That's how they thought of time, as melody, not line. And it wasn't only them. In Persia, poets described destiny as a turning wheel of thought. In China, they called recurrence the dragon's breath. Returning. In India, time had always been a circle, enormous, recurring, patient. So when Europe finally stumbled into the Renaissance and declared time to be linear, progress forward, not loops, it was actually a radical act of collective denial. The medieval rhythm didn't vanish. It just went underground, humming beneath the new obsession with progress charts and time. Even today, historians end up right back where those monks sat, outlining repeating empires, eerily similar leaders, the same mistakes with different architecture. Maybe the universe is just an expert copy editor. Let's take one long, slow breath and drift through a few last moments where the pattern almost feels intentional. In 1066, William the Conqueror sailed to England under a comet. 8 centuries later, when Halley's Comet returned, Britain again faced empire fever, colonial expansion, bold conquests, more ships. In 1215, a king of England reluctantly signed a document limiting his power. 800 years later, in 2015, the same island held a loud argument about sovereignty again. History may have changed language, but not tone. In 1453, a great Christian city fell to a Muslim empire. In 1918, a great empire fell in the same region to new states. Both times, chroniclers wrote, "The walls that stood forever have sighed." You could call that pattern searching. Or you could call it memory replaying itself. The medieval writers would have said, "The world rhymes where it remembers." So why did the Middle Ages love their coincidences so much? Maybe because coincidences were proof that the universe noticed you back. If 2 kings died on the same day, or 2 stars winked above 2 cities during war, that meant time itself was paying attention. It made chaos almost polite. Like the cosmos kept receipts. And if you've lived through recurring plagues, unpredictable monarchs, and a theological system that barely let you ask questions, polite chaos feels like mercy. Now picture the final centuries of that world, the late 1400s. Printing presses are humming, humanists are scoffing at astrology, and suddenly coincidence starts to look embarrassing, too mystical, too naive. But not to everyone. In the quieter corners, some priests kept listing their anniversaries, miracle dates, comet sightings, and coronation overlaps. They didn't call it superstition. They called it the rhythm of God's breath. And in a strange way, they weren't wrong. Because today, when we scroll through history and catch ourselves saying things like, "That's strangely similar," we're doing exactly what they did, finding shape in time to calm the noise. The belief just changed its vocabulary. And that's the heart of it. Really, the medieval love affair with coincidence was less about magic and more about making sense of being small. When you can't control history, at least you can harmonize with it. That's why saints' relics multiplied. Why kings with the same name kept meeting the same fate. Why monks found comfort in mirrored stars. Each pattern stitched up the void for a moment, a quiet assurance that everything, no matter how absurd, fits somewhere in a rhythm too big to see. Maybe that's still true. So, tonight, as the candles gutter out and the page closes, imagine those old chroniclers asleep over their inkpots, halfway convinced they were part of some elegant cosmic chorus. Maybe they were. Maybe we still are. Because history, when it hums softly enough, doesn't really tell new stories. It just tells the old ones again, until we finally fall asleep. Good night, and if you dream of patterns tonight, well, that's just the medieval way. Hey guys, tonight we're heading back. Way back to a time when the Roman Republic was still trying to convince itself it was civilized while acting like a very organized street gang with marble statues. Our subject lived in what is now Portugal, and his name was Viriathus. You've probably never heard of him, unless you've spent unhealthy hours reading late Republican war records, or know someone who studied Iberian archaeology for too long. But in his day, he was the nightmare Rome couldn't wake up from. He wasn't a king, or a senator, or even formally educated. He was, according to every Roman source that tried to insult him, a shepherd turned bandit. Which, somehow, only makes what he accomplished even funnier, because the shepherd who supposedly herded goats ended up herding Roman legions straight off cliffs. So let's roll ourselves into a blanket of time and drift into the century before Caesar ever said anything dramatic. The backdrop here is roughly the mid-2nd century BC. Rome has conquered Carthage, dominated Greece, and is now eyeing the Iberian Peninsula, modern Spain and Portugal, like a hungry diner, deciding what's left on the menu. Lusitania, the region Viriathus called home, was rugged. Think Rocky Mountains, tough scrub, and wild rivers, not exactly friendly to invaders in hobnailed sandals and shiny helmets. Rome called it the frontier. The locals just called it home, and they weren't thrilled about the new rulebook. The Romans, being Romans, started their occupation with the usual mix of tax pressure, casual extortion, and public executions masquerading as diplomacy. The Lusitanians didn't appreciate it, and, led by various local chiefs, began fighting back. One of those chiefs, his name gets fuzzy in the sources, launched a rebellion that drew in several tribes. It was crushed. The surviving warriors, around 10,000 of them, surrendered after being promised safe passage. Unfortunately, Roman promise translated roughly to "we'll kill you slightly slower." They were massacred, except for a handful who escaped, including one angry young fighter named Viriathus. That massacre wasn't just a betrayal. It was basically his origin story. If this were a modern movie, this would be the moment the lanterns dim, and the audience knows, ah, yes, the revenge arc begins. No one really knows who Viriathus was before all that. Roman authors claim he was a poor shepherd. Possibly true, most people were. But whether or not he herded sheep, he clearly had the instincts of someone who understood terrain better than textbooks. After the massacre, he didn't vanish. He multiplied. He gathered survivors, deserters, and rebels into small, fast units and run experts who knew every ravine and mountain pass by heart. Guerrilla warfare wasn't new, but Viriathus turned it into an art. He'd attack at dusk, vanish by dawn, and leave. Roman generals staring at smoke columns and empty hillsides. In one early ambush, Viriathus and his men trapped a Roman force twice their size in a ravine, pretending to flee, then circling back and closing the exits. The Romans reportedly cursed the gods, their maps, and possibly their sandals. Historical understatement suggests many died. He built his reputation fast, first as a thorn, then a spearhead. The Romans responded predictably, with escalating overconfidence. A series of commanders were sent in to pacify Lusitania. Among them were generals credited in Rome with having extensive experience, which usually meant they had once fought anyone not wearing a toga. But the moment they arrived on foreign hillsides and realized the map terrain looked more like a goat's autobiography than farmland, their confidence eroded. One commander named Servius Galbius, the ancestor of the later emperor, he promised the Lusitanians new land if they laid down arms. When they did, he slaughtered them in another round of treachery. Again, classic Roman manners. This, if you're counting, was treachery Part 2. The result, resistance, Part Infinity. Viriathus's movement grew into a style of hit and fade warfare that exhausted entire Roman legions. They couldn't find him. Scouts vanished. Supply lines died. He'd attack from fog, vanish into valleys, and then, 3 days later, his men would be raiding the Roman camp supplies. Rome thought it was fighting barbarians. In reality, it was fighting the early prototype of asymmetric warfare. Around 147 BC, things reached the point where Rome finally acknowledged him by name in dispatches. Always a bad sign for Rome. That meant Ed humiliated at least one consul. Indeed, a consul named Quintus Fabius Maximus try saying that 3 times with a straight face was beaten soundly by Viriathus's forces. The battle wasn't grand. It was clever Viriathus feigned retreat again, luring the Roman cavalry into narrow ravines, then unleashed volleys of javelins from above. The Romans lost thousands, some to fighting, most to panic. Servilianus wisely decided to negotiate instead of risk career-ending defeat. And here's the wild part. Viriathus agreed to peace. He even swore loyalty to Rome in a grand ceremony. Rome, battered and hungry for calm, declared him a friend of the Roman people, their highest non-citizen honor. Which seems nice, right? Like a Disney ending. Shepherd outsmarts empire, gets handshake, goes home. Except this is Rome, where peace treaties aged about as well as dairy in the sun. The next Roman governor, Servilius Caepio, decided friendship wasn't what Rome needed. He called Viriathus a traitor and launched a new campaign. With weary predictability, destroyed the first 2 legions sent against him. He didn't even bother showing up for peace talks anymore. He just sent polite messages suggesting the Romans go home and tend to their Senate. Senate did not appreciate the tone. But by 139 BCE, the long grinding war had worn both sides down. The numbers of surviving fighters were low, and even Viriathus Bai, now older, probably scarred and perpetually covered in dust, was realizing victories didn't pay for food, so he sent envoys to negotiate peace. Again, men who had fought with him for years, and whom he trusted like family. Their names were Audax, Ditalcus, and Minoris. And because this is antiquity, where loyalty was statistically rare, they sold him out almost immediately. The Roman commander, Caepio, allegedly bribed them to kill Viriathus in his sleep, which they did. One quiet night, in his tent, there lay the survivor, the rebel shepherd. The man who'd made Rome look foolish for a decade was murdered by the people he trusted most. When the murderers went to claim their reward, though, Caepio reportedly said one of the most perfectly Roman lines ever recorded. Rome does not pay traitors. He had them executed instead. So in the end, Viriathus died, betrayed, and the men who killed him died thinking Rome paid more for treachery than consistency. The rebellion flickered out soon after. Without his leadership, the Lusitanians fell back under Roman rule. But his legend didn't die. Even Roman historians, who had every reason to call him barbaric, still admired him. They quietly described him as brave, disciplined, loyal to his people. And here's the big one. Virtuous. The Latin word for that is ver, meaning manly, honorable, steadfast. It may even be why they recorded his name as Viriathus. It's kind of poetic, really. An empire built on roads and rules undone repeatedly by a man who moved like wind over hills. Centuries later, Portuguese rebels and soldiers would invoke his name as a symbol of defiance. Roman poets, despite themselves, used his story as a cautionary tale. Don't mistake simplicity for weakness. The shepherd boy who outmaneuvered generals became a ghost that haunted Roman military logic. And somewhere in all those mountains, the legend says the wind still carries his name. So if Rome built monuments, in marble Viriathus carved is in echoes. Next time, we'll float quietly into part 2, where we explore how Viriathus became myth after death, how Roman and Iberian writers reshaped him into hero bandit or divine avenger, depending on who was paying. Because history may have killed him once, but folklore resurrected him 100 times more. Hey! Again, tonight, we're picking up from the moment Rome thought it had won. The shepherd who had danced circles around their legions was dead, stabbed in his tent by men who learned the hard way that Rome pays moral lessons instead of cash. So now, picture the scene. A dim dawn over the Lusitanian hills. The Roman camps are quiet. A handful of surviving rebels wander mountain paths, leaderless, burned out, unsure if it's worth giving the fight another try. And back in Rome, somewhere in a marble corridor, a senator is already pretending he'd supported the campaign all along. Viriathus was gone, but the aftershocks of his existence were just starting to creep through the empire. A collective conscience. For a moment, it looked like Rome had solved its problem. With no charismatic rebel chief keeping the tribes unified, the Lusitanian resistance crumbled, and the region was absorbed under Roman control. On paper, peace had returned. In practice, though, Roman governors soon discovered that peace in Lusitania was less about tranquility and more like an extended glare of quiet hatred. Local farmers obeyed Rome's tax collectors but buried the coins rather than spend them. Villages hosted Roman patrols, with polite smiles and unspoken curses. The spirit of rebellion had sunk into the soil rather than vanish. Even after conquest, you can feel the weird tension in the sources, a kind of reluctant Roman respect for this stubborn little culture that refused to break. And then the retellings began. Every side needed its version of The Romans, as usual, couldn't make up their minds. Some historians, sort of the empire's PR writers, called him a mere letro, meaning bandit, outlaw. It was their favorite term for anyone who resisted. You were either an ally, a taxpayer, or a bandit. But others, to their own surprise, couldn't help admiring the man. Appian of Alexandria, writing from a safe academic distance, described him as strong in body, patient in toil, frugal, and loyal in his word. Which, frankly, was the kind of resume Romans liked in their own generals. The dilemma was clear. They'd just spent a decade fighting someone who behaved more like an old-school Roman than most of their current politicians did. Over time, those accounts took on a guilty shine. The further the Republic sank into corruption, the more appealing Viriathus looked, the man who fought invaders with honor while Roman governors sold favors for silver. It has the same logic that makes later rebels become unexpectedly popular with the people who defeated them. He became a moral echo, the reminder of what Roman virtue was supposed to mean before Rome industrialized hypocrisy. Even Livy, the most cautious of historians, hinted that his story was tragic, calling him worthy of better faith from Rome. That single line quietly indicts everyone from the Senate to the field camps. Meanwhile, on the Lusitanian side, a different transformation was already happening. Oral traditions retold him less as a soldier and more as a mythic protector, a wandering spirit guarding the mountains, sometimes appearing as a shepherd, cloaked in white. The kind of folklore that rolls around villages and refuses to die. By the 1st century BCE, people were already telling stories that blurred him with local gods. Some said the storms that swept the Sara da Estrella each spring came because Viriathus was still riding the hills, angry about betrayal, or maybe just checking if the Romans were gone yet. Folktales even preserved little acts of defiance. Trickster shepherds leading tax collectors in circles, or old men refusing to sell their flocks to Roman merchants. Each story blurred softly into his name, until you couldn't tell if they were describing a memory or a myth. A curious footnote: Roman veterans who retired to Iberia often married local women. Their children grew up in the era right after the wars, too young to fight, but close enough to the stories to know both sides. These families quietly merged the identities. Many grandchildren of Roman soldiers bore Lusitanian names, lived under Roman law, and grew up hearing whispered tales about the rebel shepherd who had humiliated their grandfathers. In a way, that was Viriathus's real revenge. He didn't survive as a flag. He survived as accent, rumor, and reluctant admiration by the late Republic. Roman generals occasionally cited his campaigns as cautionary lessons. Don't underestimate terrain. Don't betray peace treaties. Don't assume shepherds can't organize an army, none of which Rome seemed capable of remembering for long. During the Social War and later uprisings in Hispania, commanders referenced him almost superstitiously. One general refused to encamp on ground where the ghost of Viriathus may ambush our luck. That's how persistent his presence had become, a tactical jinx in military folklore. The next big twist came when Roman emperors began rewriting Iberian history for propaganda. The region had to be portrayed as loyal, civilized, and eternally grateful. The problem, the most famous historical figure, was the guy who'd resisted them better than anyone. So Viriathus, according to imperial myth-making, became a noble barbarian, the kind Rome could safely admire, now that he was long dead and no longer armed. Sculptures were made of Romanized warriors holding lances, the implicit nod to our worthy foes who taught us discipline. Poets compared him to early Republic heroes like Cincinnatus, the self-made farmer, righteous and pure, betrayed by lazy senators. In short, Rome posthumously adopted him, a familiar trick of empires. Destroy the rebel, then resurrect him as decoration. Even under Rome's veneer, the Iberians never fully surrendered the original version. Local myths in the western provinces kept calling him O-Sheath, the chief. And every few centuries, whenever a tax revolt flared up, someone would invoke his name again, like a talisman. In medieval Portuguese chronicles, he reappeared as a proto-Christian hero, anachronistic, sure, but convenient. Chroniclers wrote that he defended the faith of the true God before Christ was known. They couldn't bear to leave a national hero outside the church, so they retrofitted him into sanctified armor. By the Renaissance, the story had split into two parallel dreams, classical and local. The scholars loved him for defying Roman corruption. The common folk loved him for reminding them that sometimes a shepherd could still terrify an empire. Quietly, his ghost spilled into art and allegory. Renaissance painters depicted rugged shepherds staring down armored soldiers, not explicitly labeled Viriathus, but everyone knew. Poets in Lisbon and Coimbra mentioned him in passing as the first father of Portuguese courage. Even when Spain and Portugal later vied for Iberian independence, he became a shared ancestor claimed by both sides, like divorced parents politely pretending they still like each other. Spain called him a national forefather. Portugal said he was absolutely theirs. The irony would be a Musedhem. Over 2,000 years later, Lusitania is gone from the map, but its hills still bear the faint Latin traces of his legend and the occasional modern statue. A bronze man on a bluff, spear in hand, gaze turned toward eternity. He probably wouldn't have known what to make of that. Statues are very un-guerrilla things, but maybe, under that calm metal expression, there's a hint of dry satisfaction. Because in the quiet math of history, Viriathus managed something monumental. Rome erased countless enemies from existence. He survived them in reputation, slowly re-emerging. Each time tyranny needed a ghost to haunt its sleep. And so his story ends where it began, in silence and starlight. Somewhere in the mountains, a shepherd watching for enemies nobody else can see. Rome, for all its triumphs, could never quite bury the idea of him. The shepherd they mocked ended as the conscience they couldn't forget. Next time, in next part, we drift deeper into the Roman side of the story, into how his long war drove real changes in Roman military thinking, the economics of conquest, and their uneasy love-hate relationship with frontier warfare. Because sometimes, it's the enemies Rome feared that defined its best lessons. Hey again, insomniacs of history. Tonight's part is less about ambushes on mountain roads and more about paperwork, grudges, and the dull machinery of Roman self-reflection, which somehow ends up being darkly funny. Because while Viriathus was gone, Rome's bruised ego remained on the battlefield for years. And as usual, when anything went wrong in the Republic, senators immediately began holding meetings. Nothing rattled Rome quite like someone refusing to follow the script. And Viriathus's entire career had been unscripted warfare, improvisation against procedure, instinct against system. So when they finally killed him, they didn't feel victorious. They felt vaguely unwell. The first stage of Roman coping was blame. Senators scolded generals for incompetence, generals blamed unreliable terrain, and the soldiers probably blamed their boots. But under all that finger-pointing was one quiet truth. They had met an enemy who beat them at their own game. Up to that point, Roman warfare had been formulaic. March in formation, build a road, lay siege, and win. Lusitania broke all those rules. Roads didn't help when locals dismantled bridges overnight. Fortified camps were useless when your enemy watched from cliffs. And even victory felt unstable. The moment you conquered one valley, the next village rebelled. So The Senate did what it always did when uncomfortable. It tried micromanagement. New governors were dispatched with strict legal boundaries on how to make peace, which, in practice, meant they couldn't make peace without approval. A bureaucratic masterstroke that guaranteed nobody made peace at all. The war with Viriathus had squeezed Roman resources dry. Multiple legions had been stuck for years in Iberia, far from home, eating up the Republic's budget in good mood. There was already civil unrest brewing at Rome. Property crises, veteran debt, the hint of the later Gracchan reforms. The Lusitanian campaign became a legend of waste, a cautionary note about how foreign wars quietly hollowed out civic unity. In that sense, Viriathus had won something more lasting than battles. He'd forced Rome to look at its own exhaustion. The economic side is quietly fascinating. Conquering provinces was supposed to generate revenue. Taxes, mines, farmland, all theoretically profitable. But Iberia refused to cooperate. The terrain made taxation costly. Rebellions never quite stopped, and governors spent more time fighting ambushes than collecting funds. Catote el de Rome. Professional pessimist had once described Spain as a wound in the treasury. By the time Viriathus's ghost lingered, the wound was still bleeding. After his death, Roman administrators began shifting policy. Less exploitation, more colonization. They started building permanent settlements for veterans, trying to stabilize provinces through farmland instead of campaigns. The word pacification became code for, please, let's not do this again. Military doctrine changed too, though slowly and reluctantly. Viriathus's guerrilla successes exposed a crucial weakness. Roman legions were unbeatable in open combat, but embarrassingly rigid when the enemy refused to stand still. Commanders began experimenting with smaller, flexible detachments, lightly armed troops trained for skirmishes. These units became precursors to the later auxiliary forces, locally recruited soldiers who knew the land. And somewhere in these reforms, you can trace a faint line back to Viriathus, the guy whose ambushes forced the empire to adapt. It's the kind of influence empires rarely admit, but always end up absorbing. Of course, not everyone liked that. Old-school senators hated the idea of adjusting tactics to barbarian warfare. It felt dishonorable, undignified, too practical for their taste. But the professional soldiers knew better. Viriathus had shown them endurance could outlast prestige. You can feel their begrudging respect in later campaign manuals. Frontinus, a Roman strategist, writing decades after, described guerrilla tactics modeled suspiciously on the Lusitanian method. He never named Viriathus directly, but the description, sudden assembly, silent marches, feigned flight, reads like a silent citation. Politically, though, the deepest wound lay in the betrayal itself. Rome prided itself on legality, even if it ignored its own laws most days. But paying assassins, then killing them to cover it up, eroded the last shred of illusion that their wars were morally elevated. Cicero, writing much later, still mentioned Viriathus with a twinge of embarrassment. To him, the event represented Rome's darkest moral example. Victory achieved through dishonor. That wasn't philosophy. It was guilt, disguised as rhetoric. For years afterward, senators debated new laws about peace treaties and negotiations with foreign enemies, partly because of that scandal. The Republic wanted to prevent another governor from freelancing with treachery, at least when it got noticed. Publicly, they called those reforms defending Roman dignity. Privately, it was damage control. The irony thickens when you realize that Rome's entire Iberian policy never really recovered. They kept fighting minor tribal wars for generations. Even after Viriathus's death, pockets of Lusitanian resistance sprang up repeatedly. Some lasted until the reign of Augustus, nearly 80 years later. Imagine that. A ghost war dragging across 3 generations of Roman soldiers. By then, veterans' grandsons were still dying on the same plateaus that had swallowed their grandfathers. Augustus eventually had to make military presence in Hispania semi-permanent, one of the early signs that the growing empire was turning into a garrison state. It's a peaceful irony. A shepherd who fought for freedom indirectly helped build Rome's standing army infrastructure. Let us float down for a minute into a quieter part of this story. How Viriathus reshaped the idea of barbarian enemy. Before him, Roman propaganda painted opponents as chaotic, drunken masus, wild tribes, too uncivilized for strategy. But Viriathus blurred that image. He was disciplined, methodical, and according to Appian, followed a strict moral code even with prisoners. He punished looting, shared resources evenly, and honored agreements, until those agreements betrayed him. So Roman writers had a small identity crisis. If the barbarian followed virtue better than they did, who exactly was the civilized one? Most writers sidestepped it by calling him an exception among his kind. But secretly, you can sense admiration leaking through the margins. You can visualize the Senate sessions after his death. Some tired senator droning about frontier stability, while others discreetly sketch battle maps in the wax on their tablets, trying to guess how a shepherd kept an army moving unseen. Rome rarely learned lessons voluntarily, but Viriathus became one of those quiet footnotes that shifted military education. You can almost hear instructors at the later Roman academies lecturing on the dangers of neglecting local knowledge. The Republic eventually became the Empire, and its border legions were trained for precisely the wars Viriathus had once fought: rapid, flexible, terrain-based. His shadow lingered in textbooks, if not in statues. If we drift farther down the centuries, through the haze of Roman pride, we find that his memory never entirely left the city. Writers like Orosius, centuries after the fact, still used him as a moral mirror for Rome's corruption. Christian thinkers, oddly enough, admired his endurance. A pagan hero turned ethical example. The theme never aged. A humble man defying empire, loyal, noble, doomed. It's the universal bedtime story of humanity's relationship with power. And maybe that's why the legend of Viriathus never stayed buried in the provincial archives. His ghost served to many philosophical needs. Romans could use him as a token of shame. Later empires used him as a symbol of rebellion. Poets turned him into tragic poetry. Everyone found a use for the man who never meant to be useful to anyone. So what did his rebellion actually leave behind? In material terms, exhaustion. Roads half finished, forts occupied 4 decades, trade slowed by paranoia. But in conceptual terms, something subtler. The idea that empire had limits, that there were places and people beyond road building and taxation. People who could, for years, simply say, no. That's dangerous knowledge for any empire. Rome learned to adapt, yes. But it also learned humility in brief flashes before forgetting again. And perhaps that is why Viriathus fits so neatly in the long line of history. Esquire corrections, figures who remind conquerors that endurance beats grandeur when the dust settles. By the early imperial era, the old province of Lusitania finally quieted down. Rome built cities, aqueducts, and amphitheaters on top of the rebellion's scar tissue, pretending it had all been worth it. But beneath the marble and mosaic floors, the landscape stayed the same. Hard, high, and echoing in the wind. That's where he lasted longest. In the geographies itself, even now, people walk those ridges in Portugal and Spain and come across ruins. No Roman engineer ever claimed gaps where something untamed still hums. That, maybe, is where Viriathus finally won. The hills are still his territory. Next time, in Part 4, we'll drift through how later centuries reshaped his image, turning a rebel into prophecy, national icon, and literary ghost. Because some stories die once, others learn how to reincarnate. Hey, again, we left off with Viriathus as a ghostly presence in Roman conscience, the shepherd who reminded the empire of its own guilt. Tonight, we follow what happened to that ghost after Rome collapsed, when Europe started recycling old heroes into new symbols. Because Viriathus, like all good historical phantoms, never retires. He just changes wardrobe. After the fall of Rome, the Iberian Peninsula entered the centuries that later historians call the early medieval period, or, less kindly, the big confusing gap. Successive kingdoms, bishops, and warlords built their own short-lived states, And somewhere in all those shifting loyalties, the story of Viriathus quietly evolved from half-remembered folklore into moral allegory. The few Latin texts that survived dusty manuscripts sitting in monastic libraries described him not just as a rebel, but as a man betrayed by treachery. That single theme, betrayal, turned out to be universally relatable. By the 6th century, Christian chroniclers were repurposing him. To them, he wasn't just a shepherd warrior. He was the pagan prefigure of Christian righteousness, a noble soul in the wrong century. Some even claimed, with the confidence of writers who knew no one could fact-check them, that Viriathus served God, unknown, which is medieval theology's way of saying, he lived before Christ, but he would liked him. By the 12th century, when Christian kingdoms like Leon and Portugal were pushing south in their reconquests from Muslim rule, old Iberian heroes became emotional currency. Chroniclers loved inserting ancient victories into new crusades. So, naturally, Viriathus was reborn yet again, this time as a proto-Christian patriot who supposedly defended the peninsula against foreign oppressors. The irony is sharp enough to slice through parchment. The Romans were now analogues for the Moors, and the shepherd who once fought legions became a symbolic crusader. Portuguese and Castilian writers alike competed to claim him. Each said the ancient Lusitanian belonged to their patch of sacred soil. Chronicles described him as a man of our forefathers, his battles upgraded into semi-mystical national prophecy. The borders were imaginary, but the hero was useful to everyone. The early Portuguese monarchy latched onto him eagerly. King Afonso Henriques, founding ruler of Portugal in the 12th century, was said by later writers to embody the same blood and courage as Viriathus. No evidence, of course, but in political myth-making, evidence is optional. By the late Middle Ages, plays and ballads began to mention him in passing. His name appeared next to that of Roland, El Cid, or Arthur, part of the growing European pantheon of hero saints who died bravely and inconveniently. In one 15th century account, he was called simply the Son of the Hills, a rustic guardian whose spirit walks when kings forget the poor. That line stayed popular, copied into chronicles, reshaped in diverse, whispered like a charm. With the coming of the Renaissance, pagan stories were back in fashion. Humanist scholars dusted off Livy, Appian, and Diodorus, reprinting their classical works. Suddenly, Viriathus reappeared in crisp Latin, freshly legible to printers and poets who couldn't resist a moral metaphor. To Portuguese intellectuals, he became their own antiquity, proof that Lusitania wasn't just a province in Roman times, but a cradle of virtue. Renaissance writers loved to say that our land gave birth to Rome's greatest foe. In 1527, the Poetry de Barros wrote one of the first national epics linking Viriathus to the destiny of Portugal, calling him the eternal shepherd of liberty. The phrase stuck. Later, poets would repeat it endlessly, as though liberty itself needed a shepherd's crook to stay upright. Even the scholars of Spain admired him, a rare moment of Iberian consensus. For once, both countries agreed on something other than border disputes. By the 17th century, portraits and copper engravings of Viriathus began appearing in historical atlas. Of course, art obeyed its own rules. The ancient shepherd who likely wore coarse wool now appeared in Roman armor, complete with plumed helmet. Since no one could sell prints of a man in goatskin sandals, he was given muscular anatomy, apologetically Greek features, and the permanent expression of a man contemplating destiny. Accuracy was out, symbolism was in. The Baroque writers adored him. Preachers invoked him as an example of heroic suffering. Historians wrote him into sermons as the pagan whose blood foretold Christian honor. If he could have seen any of it, Viriathus would be being baffled or possibly flattered. The Romans couldn't kill him cleanly. And now clerics were turning him into a moral lesson on steadfast virtue. Skip forward 2 centuries to the 19th century. Europe is rearranging itself after Napoleon, and new nations are constructing their identities from whatever legends they can find. You can guess what happens next. Portugal and Spain again dig into antiquity, comparing themselves to their oldest symbols like families, comparing heirlooms. Out comes the shepherd hero. Liberal nationalists loved him. For revolutionary thinkers in Portugal, Viriathus was the perfect blend of ancient hero and man of the people. He wasn't an aristocrat or emperor. He was nobody who became somebody. Romantic historians called him the first Portuguese. The logic was uplifting, if geographically debatable, but it worked. His name reappeared everywhere, from school textbooks to national poetry. And once a national myth hits classrooms, immortality is guaranteed. The Spanish had their turn too. By the mid-19th century, with political chaos churning between monarchists and republicans, Viriathus became a mirror for both sides. Conservatives called him a martyr of order, while radicals proclaimed him the first Republican of Iberia, the man who resisted empire on behalf of freedom. Tessime faced two different speeches. The myth was adaptable, which is the best quality a dead hero can have. Statues began to rise bronze, towering and vaguely melancholic. In Zamora, a grand monument was unveiled in the late 1800s. A muscular figure, half shepherd, half god of resistance. Eyes fixed toward the horizon, bronze Viriathus stands there still, eternally mid-daydream, labeled to the hero from the people. Which, in a way, was true. Even literature couldn't resist. Romantic poets like Almeida Garrett wove him into odes about the soul of the mountains. Playwrights reused his betrayal scene over and over, confessing, with typical 19th century drama, that a nation dies when it forgets its shepherd. The 20th century inherited that emotion. Portuguese nationalist regimes, especially under the Estado Novo dictatorship, adopted him again, stylized now, as a symbol of strength, unity, and eternal Lusitanian spirit. It was, as always, ironic. The real Viriathus was a rebel against tyranny. The state version turned him into a patriot under authority. But that S. Political art for you? The past behaves well when you edit it in stone. After 1974, when Portugal transitioned to democracy, the revision reversed again. Viriathus re-emerged as a symbol of freedom, the ghost who opposed empires, not served them. That's the strange rhythm of his legend. Every generation drapes him in new armor without changing the skeleton beneath. Meanwhile, historians kept quietly rediscovering the actual terrain connected to him. Excavations in central Portugal uncovered small fortified hill settlements with burned layers corresponding roughly to his era hints. Of the resistance network that once frustrated Roman governors, archaeologists found weapon fragments, household tools, and handmade ceramics distinctly Nan-Roman in style. Nothing that says here lived Viriathus, of course, but the landscape whispers enough. Locals still call one plateau altar of the chief. Standing up there, the air feels unchanged. Thin, dry, full of silence. No empire or nation fully claimed those hills. That's the kind of monument Viriathus would have liked. Invisible, stubborn, and not yet conquered. You could trace his revival as the idea of rebellion itself moving through centuries, disguised as folklore, theology, politics, and modern heritage. Every empire that occupied Iberia had to acknowledge him, even as a cautionary echo. Rome recorded him in embarrassment. Christian chroniclers baptized him. Renaissance humanists idealized him. Romantic poets mourned him. Nationalists weaponized him. He fits into every age because he belongs to none. If you wander through Portugal today, you'll find the name Viriato everywhere. Cafes, schools, streets, football clubs. The man who once fought for hills now advertises espresso and local pride. And somehow, that feels right. Heroes built by the people don't vanish. They just change occupations. Even modern Portuguese soldiers refer to him in toasts, not as ancestor, but as mood, rugged, patient, quiet in pride. Because if there's one thing that history proved consistently, it's that Viriathus never needed emperors or temples. He's the everyman's kind of immortal. Next time, in the sleepy final part, Part 5, we'll close his long circle. From shepherd boy to empire breaker. From outlaw to national myth. We'll ease into the quiet thought of what his story says about endurance, identity, and the way history reuses its rebels when it runs out of heroes. Hey there! You made it to the end. Tonight, We're not racing through battles or tracing the tangled roots of myth anymore. We're standing still, just the wind, the hills, and the soft residue of a story that somehow never stopped telling itself. Viriathus's life was short, by any measure. His war spanned maybe 10 years, his victories a handful of summers, and his fame a flicker in the vast timeline of Rome. Yet here we are, talking about him more than 2 millennia later. That's the peculiar magic of certain people. They pierce through history's noise without ever meaning to. The Romans built monuments, roads, empires, and bureaucracies to survive them. All of it turned to dust and tourist attractions. But the man they mocked as a shepherd, a nobody with a spear, wandered quietly into immortality without even trying. His rebellion wasn't the kind you etch into law codes or coin faces. It was personal, local, human. He didn't want glory. He wanted fairness. And that small, impossible demand that an empire behave decently was enough to immortalize him. That might be the secret reason Viriathus stayed alive in memory while his conquerors' names faded into lists. Empires require perfection to be admired, but rebels only need sincerity. There's a poetic symmetry to it all. The Romans called Lusitania a wild frontier place, resistant to cultivation. Yet out of that rough soil came a man who cultivated something Rome couldn't control. Legend, every age since, has watered it differently, sanctifying him, politicizing him, commercializing him, but the root remains stubborn. He was the voice of endurance, not vengeance. The original rebel, with no stage fright and no illusion of safety. He didn't invent liberty. He simply acted as though it already existed. That was revolutionary enough. Imagine him, if you can, stripped of all the centuries of symbolism. No golden aura, no marble statue, just a man in a wool cloak, barefoot on rocky ground, watching Roman columns snake through the valleys below. He knows he'll probably lose. He fights anyway. No speeches, no marching bands, no manifestos. Just the sharp breath of morning. The certainty that resistance itself was a kind of dignity. And that's where his story still finds relevance, in the smaller, quieter places where power meets conscience. History tends to oversell its conquerors and undersell its survivors. Yet men like Viriathus rewrite that balance, without ever meaning to. He didn't win the war, but he won the narrative, something the Roman archives could never delete. That victory is subtle. It doesn't come with trumpets or laurel wreaths. It creeps into art, folklore, textbooks, street names. It turns into a hum. You hear it whenever an ordinary person refuses an impossible rule, whenever a forgotten village still calls its hills sacred because someone once defied authority there. Every civilization has its monuments. Every people have their murmurs. Viriathus belongs to the murmurs. If you were to ask what his story means now, the answer might sound simpler than expected. It's about the strange durability of moral rebellion. Not the loud, self-righteous kind, but the quiet one that keeps repeating, century after century, under new names. He fought for land he'd likely never rule, people who might not remember him, and principles the world still struggles to agree on. That makes him less a hero and more the pattern behind heroes. The prototype for anyone who decides fairness is non-negotiable. Rome forgot many of its generals. Lusitania forgot none of its shepherds. Fast forward to today. Tourists stand before his statue in Visu or Zamora, watching the bronze figure gaze over the landscape. Most don't know his full story. They just feel something wordless about that stance, watchful, unyielding, almost alive. It's fitting. His silence was always louder than his speeches, and sometimes that's all history really needs from us. Not perfect memory, just quiet attention. Scholars often debate if he truly deserved the titles later given to him. Father of the nation, defender of liberty, symbol of identity. But that's missing the real point. He wasn't built for titles. He was built for contradiction. He was humble yet legendary, local yet universal, defeated yet victorious. He was, in short, exactly the kind of paradox humans need to believe in when the world feels too large. And maybe that's why bedtime history loves him so much. His story ends in tiredness, not triumph, but somehow That's the most comforting ending of all. It tells us that failure doesn't cancel legacy, and that even the smallest defiance can echo longer than power expects, as the night deepens. Picture this closing scene. A shepherd, call him immortal, call him stubborn, walks the ridges of Lusitania. The land is quiet now. The empires are ruins on the horizon. He doesn't need monuments or songs. As time. Each gust of wind that crosses those old battlefields still carries a flicker of his will. A reminder that even forgotten people shape the contours of forever. That's the truest victory. Not survival of the body, but the refusal of the story to end. So, if you ever find yourself somewhere between history and sleep, think of him not as a warrior, but as a rhythm, the pattern of persistence itself. Calm, patient, older than memory. Good night, and good night to every shepherd who ever outlasted an empire.